The American Revolution proceeds in 1775 as it did historically, with battles breaking out at Lexington and Concord. However, in this alternate timeline, Britain deploys an overwhelming force and manages to suppress the rebellion. Key leaders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are either captured or go into exile. Britain ruthlessly quashes the revolutionary movement, enacting harsher measures to keep the colonies under control, including executing high-profile rebels and imposing martial law in key areas. The victory leaves Britain financially strained but determined to hold onto its North American territories, reorganizing the colonies under stricter oversight to prevent future uprisings. Colonial resentment simmers beneath the surface for decades, leading to a tense peace. The Second War of Independence, 1900, America's bloody bid for freedom. By the turn of the 20th century, resentment has grown, and the American colonies are rife with nationalist sentiment and calls for independence. Inspired by global movements towards self-determination, colonial leaders rally citizens for another bid for freedom in 1900. This time, they form a more organized resistance with support from dissident factions within Britain and sympathetic European powers. The conflict, known as the Second War of Independence, is brutal. Britain, weakened by the century's financial strains and uprisings in other colonies, is unable to mount the same level of military response it had in the 18th century. After 3 grueling years of guerrilla warfare and bloody battles, the British finally capitulate in 1903, recognizing American independence. The newly formed United States, however, is devastated economically and politically fragmented, lacking the unity and vigor that characterized its original founding. Britain, now weakened by the American War and colonial struggles, shifts its focus to preserving its remaining empire. In Europe, Germany emerges as a dominant power, fueled by rapid industrialization and militarization. With Britain in decline, Germany, led by Kaiser Gustav I, seeks to expand its influence, leading to rising tensions in Europe. World War I, Germany's triumph. The Great War, still known as World War I, erupts in 1914. But in this alternate history, a weakened Britain is less prepared, and the United States, newly independent and struggling internally, is unable to intervene. Germany, with a more formidable and organized military, achieves a decisive victory in 1917, imposing harsh terms on France, Britain, and their allies in the Treaty of Berlin. Under the treaty, Germany consolidates its dominance in Europe, annexing parts of France, expanding its colonies, and establishing itself as the leading world power. Britain, now a shell of its former self, retreats further from the global stage, focused on preserving what remains of its empire. The United States, having missed a chance to shape global affairs, continues to grapple with internal issues and remains a secondary power on the world stage. The Korean pandemic of the 1920s. In 1923, a deadly virus known as the Seoul fever spreads throughout Korea, claiming millions of lives and leaving the peninsula politically destabilized. The virus, believed to have originated in crowded industrial centers, wreaks havoc, leading to massive quarantines and a global panic that forces countries to close borders temporarily. Medical science in the 1920s is unable to halt the epidemic quickly, and Korea becomes one of the most isolated regions in the world until the virus eventually fades in the 1930s. This catastrophe disrupts East Asian geopolitics, leaving a power vacuum that Japan initially fills, eventually drawing in both the German and Soviet empires. A world without World War II, the German-Soviet Cold War. With Germany victorious in World War I, the dynamics of the 20th century shift drastically. Without a Second World War, Europe remains divided between 2 competing powers, the German Empire and the Soviet Union. Germany has cemented its influence across Europe, while the Soviet Union, under Stalin, maintains a formidable presence to the east. In this divided world, the Cold War begins not between the US and the USSR, but between Germany and the Soviet Union. The 2 superpowers engage in a fierce ideological and technological rivalry, each seeking to expand their influence across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The German Empire, with its authoritarian monarchy, contrasts sharply with the Soviet Union's communist ideology. By the 1950s, the German-Soviet Cold War extends to space. Fueled by nationalist pride and a desire to showcase technological superiority, Germany and the Soviet Union race to achieve milestones in space exploration. In 1960, Germany reaches a major victory. A German astronaut, Vincent Kloger, becomes the first human to set foot on the moon, beating the Soviet Union by nearly a decade. This achievement cements Germany's position as the dominant technological power of the era, while the Soviet Union faces internal struggles. The failed French monarchist revival. France, struggling with division, experiences a monarchist revival in the 1970s, led by Jean-Baptiste Devereux, who gains a passionate following advocating for a ceremonial monarchy. However, Devereux's assassination in 1974 shocks the nation, halting the monarchist movement and sparking conspiracy theories, with many suspecting Soviet or Republican involvement. This leaves France politically fractured, unable to restore its influence in a Germany-dominated Europe. The fall of the Soviet Union, 1986. As the Cold War drags on, the Soviet Union begins to experience economic and political strain. Without support from the West and facing a powerful German rival to the West, the USSR is isolated. By the mid-1980s, economic mismanagement, corruption, and political stagnation pushed the Soviet Union toward collapse. In 1986, a series of revolts break out in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union finally disintegrates. Germany consolidates its dominance over Europe, and the Cold War ends with Germany as the unchallenged superpower. In the absence of a Second World War, the United States never reaches the level of global dominance it achieved in our timeline. It remains influential but far behind Germany, which now controls Europe and exerts influence over former Soviet territories. America's internal divisions and lack of a galvanizing world war kept it from becoming a true superpower, and its economy and military are dwarfed by Germany's. Meanwhile, in Asia, China has steadily risen as a regional power, investing in its military and economy. With Germany's focus on Europe, China becomes increasingly assertive in its neighborhood. In 2002, China invades Taiwan, asserting its claims over the island. Without the United States as a global police force and Germany focused on Europe, no major power intervenes, allowing China to annex Taiwan and cement its control over the South China Sea. The invasion marks a turning point in Asia, and neighboring countries begin to align more closely with China, acknowledging its growing influence.